Hi everyone, this is Samaya, and Sajay, Damon, and I will be presenting our guided discussion, Pedagogical Revolution, on this week's article, Translanguaging for Vocabulary Improvement, a mixed method study with international students in the Canadian EAP program, written by our lovely professor, Dr. Angelica Galante. Now, before we begin, before we get into the study, I'd like to share with you guys a quick little story about my own experience as an ESL teacher. I used to work at a small community center in Montreal where I was teaching ESL to a small group of 6 to 7 years olds, and they all shared Arabic as an L1, and since they all went to French school, they also spoke French, but they spoke zero English when they came into my class. And I remember my boss had told me to not speak with them in French at all, that it was only supposed to be English. And I did try that in the beginning, and it did not really work at all because they didn't understand anything I was saying, and they were too afraid to speak or even try because obviously they didn't know the language. So then I started using French in the classroom just to kind of like explain, to make connections, to help them express themselves. And once I started doing that, I felt that the students were much more engaged. They would try to speak English, and if they didn't know how to say something, they would say it in French, and me and the other students would be able to help them find the words. And when they didn't even know how to say the word in French and they knew it in Arabic, I was not really able to help them since I don't speak Arabic, but the other students were able to. Now, the thing was that because it was a small community center, the parents would wait outside my classroom door near the end of class so they could pick up their kids. And one time my door was open, and one of the parents, a dad, he heard his son talking in French in my English class and me allowing it. So the parent came up to me after class and he wasn't too happy. And I remember I tried explaining to him why I allowed him to speak French, but I don't think he was really convinced. And thank God, though, he didn't end up complaining to my boss, and I just kind of kept my door closed after that. But all this to say is that there was a huge difference in students' level of engagement and confidence in their ability to learn English once they were allowed to use their entire linguistic repertoire instead of just the target language. And so I'd ask you guys to keep the story in the back of your mind while we go through our presentation, because we will come back to it. Now, to begin our discussion, we'll first go over the framework of translanguaging and plurilingualism, and then we'll go into the details of the study and the research questions, some of the implications of the study, some questions and concerns that we have, and then finally our take-home message. And so now I'll pass it on to Damien.
Perfect, thank you. So before we get into the concept of translanguaging itself, it's worth considering the linguistic paradigm of plurilingualism within which translanguaging is contained. Have you ever really taken the time to try and distinguish between bilingualism and multilingualism on the one hand and plurilingualism on the other? It's easy to find instances of the terms being used interchangeably, but over time, some differences have come to characterize each paradigm. So in a literal sense, bilingualism refers to the knowledge and the use of two languages. Over time, though, the idea hasn't fared very well in fitting within the box of its definition, and it's been widely used to describe individuals with the capacity for communication in two or more languages despite its prefix. Also, it's often related to the assumption of fluency from birth and the end goal of an idealized form of language competency, or what we would call native speakerism. This is a vestige of a monolingual conception of language, which can still be impactful on learners today. So as the terms indicate, multilingualism and plurilingualism go beyond the comfortable assumption of one or two languages as the norm. But again, what's the difference between the two? Well, one way to look at it is that multilingualism still retains that notion of native fluency as the ideal form of achievement. And that's done by compartmentalizing different languages in a repertoire and limiting the interaction among them. So for the purposes of this presentation, we can define plurilingualism as a dynamic sort of multilingualism. This in the sense that plurilingualism strives to account for the dynamic nature of language acquisition and experience. From this perspective, language isn't a rigid monolith. It's not something where we only aim for native-like proficiency. It's a fluid linguistic paradigm with no internal or external linguistic barriers limiting the experience on the learner's part. Translanguaging, as we'll see, is perhaps a defining characteristic of a plurilingual framework. Next slide, please. For 1 second. Just before we dive in, we have to ask, why adopt a plurilingual framework in the first place? Next slide, please. So our esteemed researcher and professor Angelica Galante succinctly reduces the notion to a response of diversifying landscapes. The world we live in today simply isn't the same as when the foundations of language education were set down. Growing interconnectedness at all levels of society the world over, the world is growing smaller day by day, reducing the distance between societies, peoples, and languages, which once defined identity, linguistic and otherwise. This dynamism is here to stay, and plurilingualism works on that very assumption. At a very tangible level, such a framework also provides individuals with opportunities to discover, develop, and validate their very legitimate plurilingual identities, as well as practical opportunities to grow linguistically. Conceivably, it also may lead to the creation of more equitable spaces for learning to take place. Now, a very interesting quote from the article we read says that delivering monolingual language instruction in a multilingual or plurilingual setting is incongruent with the present social reality. So next slide, please. Several pedagogical approaches have been implemented, such as intercomprehension, comparons nos langues, and translingual practices, all of which aim to move past the monolingual bias. Translanguaging, the star of tonight's show, can be seen as an attempt to create the most direct and fluid relationship between a learner's linguistic repertoire and its communicative use on their part. When considering translanguaging, the notion of repertoire is central. Another very interesting quote says that translanguaging goes beyond the focus on linguistic dimensions to explore a fluid and flexible language use that is creative, critical, and engages learning on meaning making. Next slide. So, translanguaging is often seen as a natural phenomenon in which individuals engage or at least have access to all their linguistic resources, allowing them to mix languages and linguistic elements to create new representations. This is also known as spontaneous translanguaging, and this is a very common phenomenon the world over. Really, it's everywhere and it affects all mediums of communication. Pedagogical translanguaging, on the other hand, is a purposeful use of translanguaging, a structured sort of translanguaging, which purposely taps into this phenomenon to fuel cognitive engagement and meaning-making among learners. And in fact, it requires that students use the languages in their repertoire to make meaning of the target language. So as we can see, the relationship between languages in a learner's repertoire is essential to meaning-making and learning more generally. Okie dokes, we can move along. First question for you all to consider. As a second language learner or teacher, what was one potential positive translanguaging experience and one negative translanguaging experience that you've been part of in your experience? I think this is a great takeaway question from this first little section for you to think of your own experiences.
All right, so this is Ajia, and we'll be taking a look at the study and research questions. So just to start off, a little bit about the context of the study. So the context of the study took place in Toronto, Canada, in an EAP program in an English-speaking university. And successful completion of this program granted students admission into the same university. Teachers were teaching for at least a minimum of 10 years. They had different qualifications such as master's degree in education or applied linguistics and a teaching English as a second or other language certificate. Many were proficient in an additional language other than English, and most were proficient in 3 or more different languages. A bit about the students. The students were between the ages of 18 and 21, all with international status. They were coming from different countries like Korea, Taiwan, Turkey, Japan, and Ecuador, with the vast majority from China. Next slide, please. So the methodology, there were 2 groups. The first group received 3 pedagogical translanguaging tasks, whereas the second group received 3 monolingual English-only tasks. And the study aimed to answer 2 questions. The first question being, do students who engage in pedagogical translanguaging have more gains in academic vocabulary in the target language at the end of the program compared to students who engage in traditional monolingual pedagogy? And this was done and assessed through student activities such as idioms and discourse markers, as well as pre-test and post-test comparisons. The second question aimed to answer, to what extent does pedagogical translanguaging engage EAP students in meaning-making across languages? And this was done through thematic analysis of student idioms and observations in diaries. Next slide, please. So the research question 1, we saw that students in the treatment group did better than the students in the comparison group. They used pedagogical translanguaging, may have had positive effect on their vocabulary learning, and it really did provide an opportunity for them to reflect on concepts and meanings. Next slide, please. Research question 2 can be broken down into 4 parts. So the first being gradual translanguaging used as a gradual process to meaning making. Students exercising their agency. Translanguaging used as a meaning making across languages, so comparing similarities and differences. And translanguaging used as building an inclusive learning community. Next slide, please. So translanguaging as a gradual process to meaning making. There were many points, but these were the ones that we felt were important to focus on. So it was initial shock or surprise from students' part. Spontaneous translanguaging, as Damien mentioned, is used by many language speakers of all cultures. So it fostered positive attitudes to be able to use them in the classroom and to raise meta-linguistic awareness, contributing to the development of empathy. Next slide, please. Translanguaging in action. So students exercising their agency. So students felt very safe to an active role. They were not afraid to be judged. They felt empowered and liberated. It also provided teachers an opportunity to explain the process of language as a complex process and often rooted in culture. And it really helped them develop an awareness of social conventions and deeper meaning making. Next slide, please. Thank you. It also provided them to compare similarities and differences between the different languages in their repertoire, as long as their peer and also in their peer repertoire as well. It allowed them to understand cultural relevance and compare differences, for example, how one thing is done in one language versus the other. Last but not least, translanguaging helped for building an inclusive learning community. So students did not necessarily have to be proficient in a language to use them. They were able to use technology to help them as well. And it really also provided them an opportunity to teach each other words in other languages that students spoke. And it led to inclusion rather than exclusion. So another question to reflect on is, do you think translanguaging can be used in other language learning contexts for developing other aspects of language as opposed to just vocabulary? So can you use translanguaging, for example, to develop things like reading comprehension, writing, or oral comprehension? So just take a time to think on that question. We'll hopefully come back to it later.
So now, going on to the implications and further research of the study. Including translanguaging pedagogy in the classroom, it's becoming very relevant and important because classrooms are now becoming increasingly multilingual. It's an inclusive pedagogy that allows every student, no matter the L1, to be engaged in language learning. Now, the aim of the study had been to see if translanguaging in the classroom could improve vocabulary acquisition in the target language and how much it could help students engage in more meaning making. And as such, it discussed students who had engaged in pedagogical translanguaging showed better vocabulary acquisition compared to the ones that did not participate in translanguaging. They were also much more engaged in meaning making. And even if this was just one study, pedagogical translanguaging still seems like a useful addition to the language teacher training programs. If teachers could be trained how to properly include translanguaging in the classroom and how to modify and adapt to meet the needs of their students, then it could prove to be a valuable pedagogical tool that allows all students to be more active learners and offers them opportunities that they wouldn't normally get. All this said, there's still a lot of research that needs to be done in order to tie theory and practice together. Specifically, how pedagogical translanguaging can or should be different depending on different contexts, how we can implement effective pedagogical translanguaging when students and teachers don't really share the same languages, and the extent of the impact it can have on the target language that the students are actually trying to learn. But the one big challenge that arises is the very real and existing power relations between languages. In a lot of contexts, there are certain monolingual expectations that students have to meet regarding the target language. For example, they have to take some sort of final language exam. There's also power relations among minority languages and majority languages. Even when students are encouraged to use their entire linguistic repertoire, it is hard to ignore the fact that one language has social dominance over the other languages. For example, the social dominance of English almost all around the world. And like I stated earlier, in a lot of educational contexts, students have to take some sort of final language exam in order to move up higher in their education. So it can be difficult to use a multilingual approach to language learning in order to meet monolingual expectations. However, even with this in mind, it's kind of hard to deny the benefits of translanguaging. So now, before we're going to come back to that question, before we go over that question, we're just going to play for you guys an example of translanguaging being used in the classroom as a tool by a group of students trying to learn Spanish.
No. Okay.
Okay.
So the teacher gave us a lot of work.
Yeah, this is a task that we have to do in groups.
Okay.
So it says, analyze the following Spanish idiom using your entire linguistic repertoire. Make connections with idioms that you know in other languages.
Interesting.
And we know it's a Spanish idiom.
Yeah, well, it is Spanish class, so we can assume that it's a Spanish idiom.
Okay.
Okay.
So, mete la pata.
Well, first thing that comes to mind is la. That's very similar to la in French, which is a feminine pronoun, right?
Yeah. So kind of like the equivalent of like the.
Yeah, exactly. But it's I think it's in Spanish. There's the gender references, or
exactly, unlike in English, right?
So that's a good thing to know. A good aspect of the language to be aware about.
Yeah.
Okay, good job. Good job. What else do we have?
Mete.
Okay,
kind of like first. In French, maître.
Maître, yeah.
Yeah, that's what it reminds.
Similar, very similar.
A maître, yeah. Or
even pata, similar to pat in French.
French.
Does it mean foot? Does foot, leg?
The first word that actually popped up in my head was pasta, but I don't think it makes sense.
Yeah, we're missing the
pasta, maybe.
La cucina. There we go. A little bit of Italian in here.
Okay, so
or like la pata could actually even reminds me of in French. You said pasta because la pâte.
Yeah.
Which is like dough as well.
Yeah,
like
and pasta in French, des pâtes.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's where I was getting it from.
Okay, well, we need to make sure. Someone, can you check on your dictionary to see what pata means, just to make sure we're on the right foot?
So, pata in Spanish, paw.
Paw.
Yeah.
Pata means paw.
Or foot.
Oh, it means
there's different meanings. Paw, foot is another one that also pops up too.
Okay.
Yeah.
So meter, I think that means to put, right?
Yeah, I think it's safe to assume that means to put. Met.
Okay. So put the foot. Put the foot.
Put the foot.
Sounds like shoot in the foot.
Put the foot. Like put a foot down? No, put
the paw.
Put the paw.
Oh, the foot.
Yeah, maybe foot.
I'm sorry, guys. I lost connection.
That's okay. Don't worry about it. Okay. So if we directly translate
and la pata. Mm-hmm.
If we directly translate it comes to put the foot, right?
Yeah.
And then what could that be? To put the foot?
Put the foot.
Well, interesting. I don't know what it can mean, but just looking at this, la pata, foot, it does sound similar to the word in Gujarati for foot as well, where it's like pug. Starts with PA. It's PAG, but like pug and put.
Yeah.
So again, the sound is similar.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess we can go with foot. We know it's met or put the foot. We know it's an idiom and it's in Spanish. Just have to figure out what it means.
Well, why don't we? Well, now that we've analyzed it, the teacher said we were allowed to search it.
Use our technology
to
help us out. Okay.
Well, it does like put the foot. It kind of sounds similar to the expression in English. Put your foot in your mouth? But to put your
foot down?
Is it what is it? What's the expression?
You're right. In English, there's to put your foot down. That means to be like, authoritative or to be
To not
affirmative, to be an affirmative person. So it could be that. What else could it be? So we know it means, again, the direct translation is put the foot. So when you search, I just searched it on the internet, and it says that the literal translation, they add on a bit to it. It says to put the leg on it.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so there's less words, but it implies a few. It says to make a mistake. So meter la pata means to make a mistake.
Okay.
Wow. Okay. I mean, that's interesting.
Yeah. Trying to see if I can connect it to other idioms in English.
Shoot yourself in the foot.
Oh yeah, that's true. That works too.
Shoot yourself
in the foot, which means to.
It's like I guess it's a type of mistake. You know, you did something stupid that makes you suffer in some way.
Right. You harmed yourself.
Yeah.
Hey, that's similar.
So basically, to make a mistake. So to put your foot, kind of like, it reminds me of like, kind of putting your nose where it doesn't belong. Or
yeah. That's again, it's a type of
making a mistake exactly by involving yourself in situations where you shouldn't be involved in.
And actually, I'm trying to think. In French, there's actually a direct translation. At least in Quebec, there's a direct translation. Se tirer dans le pied. To shoot yourself in the foot.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So it's a direct translation
of English. Yeah.
English. But here, for some reason, instead of shooting yourself in the foot, you put your leg on it.
Yeah.
I wonder. Well. So
like all three of those languages have, when it comes to like mistakes and things like that, they have something to do with like a body part or like foot.
The foot specifically, yeah. That's interesting. Well, I think we've learned a lot today.
Yes.
Perfect. So, great job. So I'll see you guys next week. We'll finish our assignment then.
Bye.
Okay, let's stop the recording.
Okay, so after having listened to this example and keeping in mind everything that we discussed about the study, and everything you guys know about translanguaging, we will let you guys to reflect on what possibilities do you find encouraging about translanguaging in the classroom? So that's our third question. So now moving on to the questions and concerns.
So as we've seen throughout the presentation, we see a lot of things that can be very functional in terms of an educational context regarding translanguaging. But the practical implications of pedagogical translanguaging seem to imply a need for a structure of some sort. And that's a challenge to develop it, but it's not insurmountable. The big issue that we see arises in considering which contexts are appropriate for encouraging translanguaging. So to take one example, the age of students would seem to have a huge effect on whether or not translanguaging can be manageable for teachers. Class size is another, not to mention the required professional development to use the approach in a functional way universally across a classroom. We could go on and on regarding the different variables such as societal, institutional, familial, and parental language ideology, as well as the limited ability people and educators have to properly adopting innovative practices when they don't have the resources, which sadly it's the majority of cases. The study itself is very, very insightful, but it has its limits. The student population is solely made up of university-level adults with experience in higher education. And this makes extrapolation and inferences a little bit difficult to make regarding other student populations. On another note, while the study proposed looking at translanguaging with more than 2 languages, which is the format in which it's dominant in the literature, it's important to recall that 84% of the students spoke the same first language, and hence represented a majority in the classroom. And this offers an interesting microcosm on the notion of linguistic power dynamics, which shape the experience of language. All
right, so as Maya mentioned before about the power dynamics, we know that languages all have a hierarchy, which will inevitably affect the way that pedagogical translanguaging plays out in settings like classroom. Minoritized language obviously face always these struggles in power relations. Translanguaging spaces also need to be created in order to foster and support the continuous use of pedagogical translanguaging. These spaces, for example, in academic settings, can not only be created by teachers, but at an institutional level through restructuring of programs and evaluations in order to ensure pedagogical translanguaging is fostered but also facilitated.
Finally, we know that translanguaging is a natural phenomenon, but how can we teach translanguaging as an actual pedagogical tool? In other words, how can we get students to see their translanguaging skills as a language learning tool? So our last and final question for you guys is, what are the most significant challenges you see with implementing pedagogical translanguaging in the classroom? So finally, now moving on to our take-home message. So to conclude, pedagogical translanguaging has the potential of really changing for the better the way we teach and look at second language learning. Going back to the story I had shared earlier, I was able to see firsthand the positive impact that translanguaging had on my students' learning, even if I was not aware at that time that what I was doing with them was actually called translanguaging. However, like we discussed in our presentation, there's still a lot of challenges facing pedagogical translanguaging, specifically in terms of power and monolingual expectations, which influence the way we look at language and language learning. For example, going back to my story in the beginning, when I tried implementing translanguaging in my classroom, I faced resistance from one of the parents because he had a set of monolingual expectations for his child, and the same applies for my boss, who encouraged me to only use English in the classroom because she viewed languages as being very separate. And so the question that arises and that we ask ourselves is this: do we first need a change in the paradigm of language and language learning before we can implement translanguaging in the classroom, or is pedagogical translanguaging the push that is actually needed for this shift in the paradigm to take place? And so with this last thought, we conclude our presentation. Here are the questions again, the questions that we asked about the presentation, our references, and thank you everyone for listening, and we hope you enjoyed our discussion.
Thank you.